Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the horizon bleeds into the dust and legends are not born. They are excavated from the graves of the past. Tonight's story is about a quiet woman, a loud past, and the simple truth that when you kick over a hornet's nest, you'd best be prepared to deal with the queen. Dry Hollow was a town held together by faith and fragile hope, a collection of sun-bleached buildings clinging to the edge of a vast and forgiving desert. It was a place where peace was a commodity more precious than water, and silence was the sound of survival. For Marla Kane, that silence was a sanctuary. It was the soil in which she had buried her former self, a woman she no longer claimed to know. Her life was now measured in simple, tangible things. The weight of a ripe tomato in her palm, the comforting warmth of her horse, Paulo, nuzzling her shoulder, the familiar ache in her back after a day spent tending the small plot of land behind her homestead. This was the life she had built with Jacob. He hadn't been a man of violence or grand ambition. He was a carpenter, a man whose strength was in his gentle hands and his steady, quiet love. When the sickness took him 2 years prior, it had taken the last anchor to her old world. In his grave, she had buried more than a husband. She had interred a ghost named Castrell, a name whispered in the shadows of the border wars, a name synonymous with a blade in the dark and a single, precise gunshot from a mile away. She had sold her matched Schofield revolvers, her custom-made Bowie knife, and her lightweight sharpshooter's rifle. Or so the world believed. In reality, she had sealed them in a heavy, oilskin-wrapped chest and buried them deep in the cool, dark earth of the storm cellar behind her house. She had planted a rosebush over the spot, a living headstone for a dead life. Marla Kane, the widow who grew vegetables and spoke more to her horse than to people, was a fiction she had carefully, lovingly constructed. The fiction was torn to shreds on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. They came from the east, a miasma of dust and noise that resolved itself into a dozen riders. They called themselves the Dust Serpents, a plague on the land, led by a young, arrogant buck named Silas Cord who rode with the swagger of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. They were not subtle raiders, they were a conquering army. The town's single, aging sheriff stood his ground for all of 30 seconds before a bullet cut him down. The Dust Serpents swarmed the street, their laughter sharp and cruel as they fired their guns into the air, into doors, into the heart of Dry Hollow's fragile peace. They stormed the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, dragging people into the street, their eyes wild with the thrill of easy power. Marla watched from the window of her small homestead at the edge of town. Her first instinct was the old one, the cold, analytical process of threat assessment. 12 riders. Poor fire discipline. Overconfident. Leader is the one on the bay mare, loud and preening. Vulnerable. The thoughts came in bidden, ghosts from the cellar. She pushed them down, her hands clenching the rough fabric of her apron. That was not her life anymore. She was Marla Kane. She was a widow. She was a gardener. Then it happened. The Miller family, who lived 2 doors down, tried to make a run for it from the back of their house. A young serpent, no older than 18, saw them. He let out a whoop and spurred his horse, cutting them off. Mrs. Miller screamed, shielding her 8-year-old son Thomas. The boy, terrified, stumbled and fell in the dusty street, right in front of Marla's picket fence. Silas Cord reined in his horse, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look what we have here," he drawled, his voice carrying in the sudden, tense silence. "A little runaway." "Please, Mrs. Miller begged, her hands outstretched. "He's just a boy." Cord looked at the child, then at his men, a performer playing to his audience. He raised his pistol, enjoying the collective gasp of the captive townsfolk. "In my world," he said, "there are no boys. Only targets." The gunshot was a flat, ugly crack in the hot air. Little Thomas Miller, who just that morning had chased a stray dog past Marla's garden, lay still in the dust. A collective wail of horror and grief rose from the townspeople. Inside her house, Marla Kane did not scream. She did not cry. Something inside her, the carefully constructed facade of the gentle widow, simply shattered. The roses she had planted on the grave of her past withered and turned to ash. The peace she had cherished was a lie, a shallow grave that a single gunshot had just ripped open. She turned away from the window, her movements calm, deliberate. She walked through her small, quiet house, past the rocking chair Jacob had made for her, past the shelf with their one wedding portrait. She walked out the back door and across the yard to the storm cellar. She pulled open the heavy wooden doors, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the cool darkness. The townsfolk, huddled in the street under the guns of the dust serpents, saw only a town falling into terror and despair. They did not see the widow walk to her cellar. They did not see her dig. They did not know that the most dangerous thing in all of Dry Hollow was not the arrogant outlaw in the street, but the ghost who was, at that very moment, clawing her way back to the land of the living. The air in the storm cellar was thick with the scent of damp earth, stored preserves, and time itself. For 2 years, it had been a place of shelter from the occasional desert squall, a larder for her harvests. Now, it was a tomb to be unsealed. Marla lit a lantern, the flickering yellow light casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the jars of peaches and pickled beans look like strange, alchemical specimens. She ignored them, moving to the far corner where a neat stack of old firewood was piled. She didn't need a shovel. Her hands, the same hands that gently tended seedlings and braided Apollo's mane, were all she required. She moved the wood with an efficient, practiced economy of motion, revealing the packed earth floor beneath. There was no marker, no sign, but she knew the spot to the inch. She knelt, the rough fabric of her dress scratching against the dirt, and began to dig. The earth was cool and pliant. She worked with a focused intensity, her fingers digging, pulling, scraping away the layers of her new life. The dirt caked under her nails, a grim sacrament. She was not just digging up a box, she was excavating a soul, her own, peeling back the soft, gentle loam of Marla the gardener to reveal the hard, cold bedrock of Kestrel the killer. After a foot of digging, her fingers struck the oilskin wrapping. The sound, a dull thud, echoed in the small space like a coffin lid closing. She worked faster, clearing the remaining dirt until the long, heavy chest was fully exposed. It took all her strength to haul it from the hole, the muscles in her back and arms, conditioned by farm labor, straining with the dead weight of her past. She wiped the dirt from the heavy brass latches. They were stiff, but opened with a groan of protest. She lifted the lid. The lantern light spilled inside, glinting off blued steel and polished wood. The scent that rose from the chest was the antithesis of the cellar's earthy smell. It was the sharp, clean, metallic perfume of well-oiled machinery and worn leather. It was the smell of death. Methodically, she began to unpack the contents, laying them out on an old blanket. First came the gun belt, a custom piece of dark, supple leather, the holsters perfectly molded to the weapons they were built for. Then, the guns themselves. A matched pair of Schofield Model 3 revolvers, modified for a smoother trigger pull and a faster reload. She picked one up. The weight was familiar, an old friend's handshake. Her fingers instinctively found their place on the worn walnut grip. Next came the knives. Not just the formidable Bowie knife with its razor-sharp, clip point, but a set of smaller, perfectly balanced throwing knives, and a slender stiletto, a weapon for silent, intimate work. Then, the tools of a long-range hunter, a spyglass, a set of oilcloth-wrapped cleaning tools, and finally, the rifle. It was a Sharps 1870 for Creedmoor, a specialized target rifle known for its incredible accuracy at extreme distances. Its long, heavy barrel and finely calibrated sights were not the tools of a common gunslinger, but of an artist whose medium was trajectory and windage. Beneath the weapons was a change of clothes, simple, practical, and dark. A man's canvas trousers, a dark linen shirt, a leather vest with hidden pockets, and soft-soled boots that would make no sound on a dusty street. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a separate oilskin pouch, was the ledger. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with a neat, precise script. It was not a diary. It was a record of her past life. Names, locations, payouts, and brief, cryptic notes. Jaime L.Q. Kilo Vargas, Laredo. Paid by Wells Fargo. Likes cards, cheats with a holdout device in his left sleeve. The Dalton Brothers. Rock Creek Pass. Union Pacific Contract. Travel with a decoy wagon. It was a litany of the dead, a testament to her cold, detached professionalism. She had been a tool, a weapon wielded by powerful men in the shadow wars fought over railways, land grants, and gold claims. She ran her thumb over the last entry, made just before she met Jacob. Marcus Thorne, Santa Fe. Personal contract. Final entry. She had hunted Thorn, a brutal man who had killed her mentor, and it had been a bloody, difficult affair that had soured her on the entire business. Meeting Jacob, a man who built things instead of destroying them, had been her escape. Now, there were new names to be written in the ledger. Silas Cord, the Dust Serpents. She stripped off her simple, homespun dress, the last vestiges of Marla Kane, and let it fall to the dirt floor. She dressed in the dark, practical clothes from the chest. The fabric felt like a second skin. She buckled the gun belt around her narrow waist, the weight of the Schofield settling on her hips like a familiar embrace. The Bowie knife found its home in the small of her back. She was no longer a widow in mourning. She was a predator donning her camouflage. When she emerged from the cellar, the moon was high, casting a silver, ghostly light over the now occupied town of Dry Hollow. The sounds of drunken celebration drifted from the saloon, a raucous, ugly noise that profaned the desert's sacred quiet. She walked to the corral, her steps silent. Apollo, her horse, whinnied softly, sensing the change in her. The woman who approached him was not the one who had given him his morning oats. Her scent was the same, but her posture, the energy radiating from her, was different. It was sharper, colder, utterly focused. "Easy boy," she whispered, her voice a low murmur. She saddled him not with the simple riding saddle she used for errands, but with a lighter, more functional saddle from the chest, complete with a scabbard for the Sharp's rifle. She did not ride into town. Not yet. A frontal assault was for fools and egotists. Her way was the way of the kestrel. To circle, to observe, to understand the prey, and then to strike from an angle it never sees coming. She mounted Apollo and rode not towards Dry Hollow, but away from it, melting into the labyrinth of canyons and mesas that bordered the desert. She became a shadow among shadows, a ghost returning to her hunting grounds. The town of Dry Hollow had a new, unseen guardian. And the Dust Serpents, drunk and victorious in their stolen saloon, had no idea that their death warrants had just been signed, sealed, and delivered by the woman they had so foolishly ignored. For 2 days, Marla Kane vanished. To the terrorized populace of Dry Hollow, she was just another homesteader, likely hiding in her house like everyone else. To the Dust Serpents, she didn't even exist. They were too busy enjoying the spoils of their conquest. They had turned the town into their private fiefdom, taking over the saloon as their headquarters, their horses tied carelessly to the hitching posts, their loud, drunken boasts echoing down the main street day and night. But Marla was watching. From the high, sun-baked ridges that overlooked the town, she became a patient, calculating observer. She spent the daylight hours motionless, using her spyglass to map their movements, learn their faces, and identify their routines. She was a strategist, dissecting her enemy. She saw Silas Cord, the arrogant leader, who rarely left the saloon, holding court like a petty king. She identified his second-in-command, a grizzled, one-eyed outlaw named Patch Malone, who seemed to be the only one with a shred of tactical sense. She noted the guards they posted sloppy, inattentive men who were more interested in their whiskey flasks than the surrounding dessert. She saw their arrogance, their lack of discipline. They believed they had already won. This was the fatal flaw she would exploit. She decided her first target would not be Cord. To kill the leader first would scatter the rest like quail. She needed to dismantle them piece by piece, to cultivate fear and paranoia until they turned on each other. Her target was a man named Cackler Jones, a lanky outlaw with a hyena's laugh who had been the one to shoot Sheriff Miller. He was cruel, loud, and, as Marla observed, had a predictable bladder. Every night, around midnight, he would stumble out the back of the saloon to relieve himself against the wall of the blacksmith's forge. On the second night, Marla made her move. She left Apollo tethered in a hidden canyon and slipped towards the town on foot, a ghost moving through the moon-drenched landscape. She was armed not with her rifle or her pistols, but with the Bowie knife and the stiletto. This first kill needed to be silent, intimate, and it needed to leave a message. She circled around the back of the town, using the deep shadows cast by the buildings as her cover. She reached the alley behind the saloon, the raucous sounds of a badly played piano and drunken singing masking any slight noise she might make. She flattened herself into the deep doorway of the abandoned livery stable, directly across from the blacksmith's forge. And then she waited. Patience was her greatest weapon, a skill honed over years of waiting for a target to make a single, fatal mistake. She became part of the shadow, her breathing slow and shallow, her senses alive to the night. She heard the scuttling of a mouse, the lonely call of a distant coyote, the rhythmic creak of the saloon sign in the gentle night breeze. Finally, the back door of the saloon swung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light into the alley. Cowboy Jones stumbled out, true to his routine, muttering to himself. He leaned against the forge wall, and the sound of his relief was a vulgar intrusion into the night's quiet dignity. Marla moved. She did not rush. She flowed out of the doorway like smoke, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the packed earth. He never heard her. His first inkling that he was not alone was a hand clamping over his mouth, stifling his surprised grunt. His second was the cold, sharp sting of the stiletto sliding between his ribs, a quick, precise, and brutally efficient motion that pierced his heart. His body went rigid for a second, then limp, his life extinguishing in a silent, final exhalation. She lowered his body gently to the ground, propping him up against the wall as if he were merely a drunk who had passed out. But the message had to be clear. She took the red bandana from around his neck, symbol of the dust serpents, and stuffed it deep into his mouth. Then she used her bowie knife to carve a single, stylized feather sign of the kestrel into the wooden door of the forge, directly above his head. She was gone as silently as she had come, melting back into the desert night, leaving behind the first dead piece of the puzzle. It was nearly an hour before he was found. Patch Malone, the one-eyed second, came out looking for him. His bellow of shock and rage brought the others pouring out of the saloon. They crowded around the body, their drunken bravado evaporating in the cold, moonlit alley. They saw the bandana. They saw the still wet blood pooling in the dust. And they saw the feather carved into the door. "What the hell is that?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. Silas Cord pushed his way through the crowd, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked at the body, at the strange symbol. It meant nothing to him. "It's a message," he snarled, trying to project an authority he no longer felt. "One of the townsfolk thinks he's a tough man. We'll find him. We'll gut him and hang him in the street for everyone to see." But his men were not convinced. This was not the work of a scared farmer with a rusty shotgun. This was clean, silent, and professional. This was the work of a ghost. They dragged Cackler's body away, their eyes now constantly scanning the shadows, their laughter replaced by nervous whispers. The seed of fear had been planted, and Marla, watching from the ridge, knew that fear, properly nurtured, was a more effective weapon than any bullet. 1 down, 11 to go. The murder of Cowboy Jones changed the atmosphere in Dry Hollow from one of arrogant occupation to one of tense, simmering paranoia. The dust serpents no longer swaggered, they scurried. They moved in groups, their hands never far from their pistols, their eyes darting towards the rooftops and the deep, dark shadows between buildings. Silas Cord's authority, built on bluster and easy victory, began to fray at the edges. He tried to reassert control through brutality. He rounded up a half-dozen townsmen, including the blacksmith, a stout man named Jebediah, and shoved them into the town's small, stone jail. "The killing stops when you give me the man who did this," Cord had announced to the terrified town. "Every day you stay silent, the accommodations get worse." Marla observed this new development from afar, a cold anger settling in her heart. Cord was a blunt instrument, using terror as his only tool. He couldn't conceive of a threat he couldn't see and bully into submission. This gave Marla her next opportunity. Cord had holed up his men, turning the saloon into a fortress. Direct assault was still a fool's errand. So, she would turn his fortress into a trap, and his own men into the bait. Her next targets were a pair of brothers, the Cates boys, known for being inseparable and for their shared post as lookouts on the roof of the general store, a position that gave them a clear view of the entire street. They were jittery, inexperienced, and utterly terrified. For this, Marla would use her rifle. She had spent a full day charting the sun's path across the sky, noting every reflection, every shadow. She found the perfect spot, the abandoned upper floor of the assayer's office, a building that had been empty for years. It was across the street, and 2 buildings down from the general store, its windows coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. From the outside, it was just another derelict building. From the inside, a small, carefully cleaned patch on the window gave her a perfect, oblique view of the general store's roof. She slipped into the town before dawn, a phantom in the pre-light gloom, and settled into her nest. She did not plan to simply shoot them. That was too simple, and would instantly reveal her position. Her plan was more subtle, designed to deepen the mystery and magnify the fear. The Cates brothers took up their post shortly after sunrise, their rifles held awkwardly, their heads constantly swiveling. Marla watched them through the sights of her Sharps rifle, her breathing slow and even. She waited for hours, a statue of patient lethality, until the sun was high and hot in the sky. Her first shot was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the large, glass sign of the mercantile, which hung just below the edge of the roof. The heavy, high-velocity round struck the thick glass, not shattering it completely, but creating a spiderweb of cracks and a sound like a giant whip crack. Both brothers jumped, spinning around, trying to locate the source of the noise. They fired their own rifles wildly in the direction of the assayer's office, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the wooden facade. Marla did not move. She waited. The shots had drawn the attention of the men in the saloon, who poured into the street, guns drawn, staring up at the Cates brothers. "What is it? What did you see?" Patch Malone yelled from below. "Someone shot at us." From the assayer's office, the older brother shouted back, his voice high with panic. Silas Cord ordered for men to storm the building. Marla was already gone. She had slipped out the back and circled around to a new position, the hayloft of the livery stable at the end of the street. She watched as the outlaws kicked in the door of the assayer's office, finding it empty, filled with nothing but dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of a shooter. No spent cartridge. Nothing. The outlaws were now confused, standing in the middle of the street, staring at the empty building. The Cates brothers, still on the roof, had relaxed slightly, believing the danger had passed. This was the moment Marla had been waiting for. From the hayloft, she had a clear line of sight. This time, her target was the metal strap that held up the right side of the heavy mercantile sign. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The bullet, fired from an entirely new direction, severed the strap with a high-pitched ping. The heavy sign, now held only by one strap, swung down like a guillotine. It swept across the edge of the roof where the Cates brothers were standing. They had no time to react. The sign smashed into them, sending both men screaming over the edge. They fell to stories, landing in a broken, tangled heap in the dust of the street below, one of them killed instantly, the other gravely injured and dying. The remaining dust serpents stood frozen in shock and horror. Two more of their own were dead, killed by a falling sign. It was a freak accident, but it had been bookended by two rifle shots, from two different and traceable locations. It made no sense. It was impossible. It was the work of a phantom, a ghost who could be everywhere and nowhere at once, a killer who could turn the town itself into a weapon. Silas Cord stared at the bodies, then at the empty buildings surrounding him. His face, which was usually flushed with arrogant confidence, was now ashen. The whispers among his men grew louder. This wasn't a man they were fighting. It was a demon, a ghost. The town itself was cursed, and it was killing them one by one. From the darkness of the hayloft, Marla ejected the spent cartridge, its metallic click the only sound she made. She had taken two more without leaving a single clue to her location. She had turned their own paranoia against them. The town wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a kestrel. And the hunt was far from over. The bizarre, seemingly impossible deaths of the Cates brothers plunged the dust serpents into a state of near mutiny. The saloon, once a place of boisterous celebration, became a pressure cooker of fear and accusation. The remaining 9 outlaws were like wolves in a cage, turning on each other, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Silas Cord's authority was in tatters. His orders were met with sullen glares and muttered defiance. They were no longer an occupying army, they were prisoners, and their jailer was an invisible, malevolent force. Marla knew that direct confrontation was still unwise. Her strength was in her mystique, in the psychological terror she wielded. It was time to escalate that terror. Her new objective was not to kill, but to cripple. She would attack their most vital resource, the one thing besides their guns that kept them in power, their horses. The gang kept their mounts in the town's livery stable. It was a large, wooden structure, tinder dry from the relentless desert sun. A single guard was posted at the wide main doors, but he was jumpy and ineffective, his attention focused on the shadows outside, not on the structure he was supposed to be protecting. For this task, Marla needed a different set of tools, ones that spoke of her deep, practical knowledge of the land. She spent a day gathering what she needed from the desert's harsh pantry, a particular type of lawmen that, when ingested, caused agitation and madness in livestock, and a pouch full of iron rust shavings, meticulously scraped from an old, abandoned water pump. Her plan was twofold, designed to attack them from the inside and out. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, she began her work. First, the water. The town's water came from a single, deep well with a horse-drawn trough next to it. It was the only source of fresh water for miles. Moving with a silence that defied the senses, she crept to the well. She didn't poison the well itself. Townsfolk, her prisoners, still needed it. Instead, she emptied the pouch of rust shavings directly into the horse trough. The fine, reddish-brown powder dissolved, turning the water a murky and appetizing color, tainting it with a foul, metallic taste. Horses, sensitive creatures, would refuse to drink it unless they were desperately thirsty. Next, she moved to the livery stable. The guard at the front was a man named Slim, a twitchy outlaw who jumped at the sound of his own heartbeat. Marla had no intention of going through the front. She circled to the back, where a small, forgotten hay-loading door was located on the second floor. Using a length of rope and a grappling hook she had retrieved from her cache, she scaled the wall with the silent agility of a spider, slipping through the door and into the hayloft. Below her, the horses shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing her presence. She could hear Slim pacing back and forth outside the main entrance. From the hayloft, she began to drop small, carefully measured handfuls of the dried lawmen into the feed bins of each stall. It was a subtle act of sabotage, one that wouldn't be noticed until it was too late. Her work done, she rappelled back down the wall and vanished into the night, leaving behind two perfectly seated time bombs of chaos. The next morning, the first bomb went off. The outlaw assigned to water the horses led them to the trough and discovered the rust-colored water. He cursed, calling for Patch Malone. They examined the water, sniffing it, and able to identify the cause. "Looks like the well's gone bad," Patch grumbled. "Just let him drink. They're horses, not kings." But the horses refused. They shied away from the trough, snorting in distaste. The men, frustrated and on edge, tried to force them, but the animals would not cooperate. A vital part of their operation, their mobility, was now compromised. The second bomb detonated an hour later. The lawmen began to take effect. The horses, already agitated from thirst, became frenzied. They kicked at their stalls, their eyes rolling wildly, whinnying in a panic. The commotion brought all the outlaws running. They found their prized mounts in a state of madness. One horse had already managed to kick its stall door off its hinges and was now careening around inside of the stable, a danger to itself and everyone else. Silas Cord, his face a mask of fury, ordered his men to calm the animals. But it was impossible. In their panicked, delirious state, the horses were untamable. The attempt to control them devolved into a violent, chaotic scene of rearing, kicking animals, and cursing terrified men. In the melee, one of the outlaws, a man named Deacon, was struck in the head by a flailing hoof and went down hard, his skull crushed. Another one dead, and not a shot had been fired. To make matters worse, the crazed horse that had broken free knocked over a lantern that had been foolishly brought inside. The flame ignited the dry hay, and in seconds, the livery stable was an inferno. The men scrambled to get out, forced to abandon their horses to the flames. They stood in the street, helpless, and watched their greatest asset, their means of escape, their symbol of power, go up in a roaring column of smoke and fire. The screams of the dying animals were a horrifying soundtrack to their utter defeat. They were now trapped, stranded in a town that hated them, surrounded by a desert that would kill them, and hunted by a phantom that was dismantling them with the cold, patient precision of a master watchmaker. They had lost another man, their transportation, and the last vestiges of their morale. Silas Cord stared at the burning stable, his face illuminated by the destructive orange glow. His gang was rotting from the inside out. He didn't know how, but he knew who was responsible. It was the ghost with the feather sign, the Kestrel. And he realized, with a chilling certainty that froze the marrow in his bones, that she wasn't just trying to kill them. She was enjoying it. She was breaking them down, piece by rusty, rotten piece. The destruction of the livery stable and the loss of their horses was the breaking point. The dust serpents were no longer a gang. They were 8 terrified, exhausted men on foot, trapped in a town that was actively trying to kill them. The veneer of civilization was cracking, revealing the feral, desperate animals beneath. Their fear, once a quiet whisper, was now a constant, primal scream. Silas Cord knew he had lost control. His threats were empty, his authority a joke. It was Patch Malone, the one-eyed veteran, who took command, his pragmatism born of a long life of survival. "We're done here," Patch announced to the assembled, smoke-stained survivors. "We ain't finding this ghost. We're leaving. On foot. We'll head south at sundown. The desert's a risk, but it's a better gamble than staying here to be picked off by some damn spook." There were grumbles, but no one argued. The plan was desperate, but it was a plan. For the rest of the day, they prepared, gathering what little water they could, hoarding food from the general store. Their movements were furtive, their faces grim. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hunted look of cornered prey. Marla watched them from her perch, anticipating their move. She knew they would run, and she knew she could not let them escape. Her promise was not just to the memory of little Thomas Miller, but to the town itself. The serpents had to pay their debt here, in the dust of Dry Hollow. She decided to change her tactics. The time for subtle, psychological warfare was over. Their desperation would make them unpredictable. It was time for a direct, devastating blow that would shatter their will to even attempt an escape. It was time to remind them not just of the Kestrel's cunning, but of her deadly precision. Her target would be their makeshift command center, the saloon. Her weapon would be the Sharp's rifle, and her stage would be the entire town. She chose her position with masterly care. Not a rooftop, not a window. She went to Jebediah's blacksmith forge. The building was stone, its walls thick, offering superior cover. Inside, the main forge had a narrow, vertical slit in the wall, used to vent smoke and heat. It was a perfect sniper's loophole, offering a commanding, if narrow, view of the saloon's front entrance from an unexpected, ground-level position. She slipped into the forge in the late afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the street. She settled in, the cold stone a comfort at her back. She rested the long, heavy barrel of the Sharps on the edge of the vent slit. Through her sights, the world became a circle, the saloon's batwing doors perfectly framed. She was a surgeon, and the entire street was her operating theater. As dusk began to settle, the outlaws started to move. 4 of them, including Patch Malone, came out of the saloon, carrying sacks of supplies. They were preparing for their nighttime march. They gathered in a loose group in front of the saloon, arguing about the best route south. Marla took a slow, deep breath, letting half of it out. Her heartbeat was the only rhythm in her world. Her first target was a heavy-set outlaw named Gordo, who was standing slightly apart from the others, making him a clean shot. She squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle fired with a deafening boom that was magnified by the enclosed space of the forge. The sound was unlike the sharp crack of a pistol. It was a deep, resonant roar, a sound of thunder and judgment. Across the street, Gordo was thrown backwards as if struck by an invisible fist, a massive hole appearing in his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. Chaos erupted. The remaining 3 outlaws dove for cover, firing their pistols wildly. They had no idea where the shot had come from. The sound had seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the buildings. Patch Malone, the veteran, correctly identified that the shot was low, not from a roof, and he scrambled behind a water trough. Marla worked the falling block action of her rifle, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a new one. Her movements were fluid, economical, betraying no haste. Her next target was another outlaw, a man who had made the mistake of hiding behind a wooden hitching post, which offered no real protection from the .50 caliber slug of the Sharps. She fired again. The bullet tore through the wood as if it were paper and took the man in the gut. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed. 2 shots. 2 dead. The street was now a kill zone. The 2 survivors, Patch and another man, were pinned down, terrified. From inside the saloon, Silas Cord and the remaining 3 men began firing blindly through the windows, their bullets splintering the facades of the buildings across the street. None of them coming anywhere near the forge. Marla remained calm. She was in her element. This was the cold, deadly calculus that she understood better than anything else. She had them trapped. She could wait. Patch Malone knew they were dead if they stayed put. "We run for the store," he yelled to the other survivor. "On three. 1, 2, 3. Both men broke from cover, sprinting across the open street. It was a desperate, foolish move. Marla tracked the second man, leading him slightly, and fired her third shot. He tumbled head over heels, his flight to safety cut brutally short. Patch, miraculously, made it, diving through the door of the general store. He was alone, his entire sortie wiped out in less than a minute. Silence descended on the street, broken only by the moans of the gut-shot outlaw. From inside the saloon, the shooting stopped. They now knew. The ghost was real, and she carried a cannon. To step outside was suicide. Their plan to escape was dead. Their hope was dead. Marla sighted on the wounded man. A professional did not let a target suffer. Her fourth shot was a mercy, silencing his cries. She then slowly, deliberately, fired a fifth round into the center of the saloon's batwing doors, the heavy slug splintering the wood and punching through into the room beyond. It was a punctuation mark. A statement. "I am still here. You are not leaving. I will kill you all." Inside the saloon, the 5 remaining outlaws, including Silas Cord, huddled on the floor, their faces white with terror. They were besieged. The Kestrel was outside, and she had turned Main Street into her personal shooting gallery. The desert was no longer an option. The only journey left for them was the short, bloody walk to the grave. The siege lasted through the night. A heavy, pregnant silence lay over Dry Hollow, a stark contrast to the thunderous violence that had preceded it. The 5 outlaws trapped in the saloon and Patch Malone, isolated in the general store, did not dare show themselves. They were mice in a trap, and the cat was patient. Marla did not stay in the forge. To remain in one position was to become a target. After her final, declarative shot, she had slipped out the back and circled the town, retrieving her pistols and knives. She moved through the darkness like a whisper, her purpose shifting. The rifle had broken their will to run. Now, it was time to dismantle their sanctuary. Her new target was the saloon itself, but not the men inside. She would attack the building, their last bastion of safety. She crept to the rear of the saloon, a place they had neglected in their panic. A single, grimy window looked into a small storage room. Using the butt of her knife, she carefully chipped away at the old, dried putty around a single pane of glass until it was loose enough to remove. The opening was small, but large enough for her purpose. From a pouch, she produced several small, tightly wrapped bundles of cloth, soaked in kerosene she had taken from the lamps in the assayer's office. She lit one with a lucifer match, the flame sputtering to life. She tossed it through the opening. Then another, and another. They landed among stacks of old newspapers, wooden crates of whiskey, and other flammable refuse. She did not wait to see the result. She moved to the front of the town, concealing herself in the deep shadows of the undertaker's office, a fitting place for a final vigil. She drew one of her Schofields and waited. It took 10 minutes. At first, it was just a faint, orange flicker visible through the saloon's back window. Then, a plume of greasy black smoke began to curl out from under the eaves. Someone inside started to cough. Then came the shout, "Fire!" Panic erupted within the saloon. The fire, fed by the high-proof whiskey, roared to life with an explosive whoosh. Thick, choking smoke filled the room. For the men inside, the choice was now brutally simple: burn to death, or face the phantom outside. The batwing doors burst open. The 5 men, Silas Cord among them, stumbled out coughing, their eyes streaming, silhouetted against the growing inferno behind them. They were completely disoriented, blinded by the smoke and the sudden darkness of the street. They were perfect targets. Marla stepped out of the shadows, a calm, resolute figure against the flickering firelight. "Cord," she called out, her voice clear and carrying in the night air. The men spun around, raising their pistols. Marla was faster. Her Schofield barked twice, the shots so close together they sounded like one. 2 of the outlaws fell, shot cleanly through the chest. The remaining 3, including Silas, opened fire, their shots wild and panicked. Marla dropped to one knee, making herself a smaller target, the outlaw's bullets whining past her in the dark. She fired again. Another outlaw clutched his throat and fell. Now it was just Silas Cord and one other. They dove for cover behind the same water trough where Patch's men had been slaughtered. The fire in the saloon was now a roaring blaze, casting the entire street in a hellish, dancing light. The building's front facade groaned and then collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and embers. Their fortress was gone. "Give it up, Cord," Marla called, her voice steady, emotionless. "There's nowhere left to run." From behind the trough, Silas's voice, raw with hatred and terror, screamed back. "Who are you?" Marla stood up slowly, reloading her pistol with fresh cartridges, the metallic clicks loud in the sudden quiet. "I'm the widow of the man whose town you burned," she said, though it was only a fraction of the truth. "I'm the final entry in your ledger. I'm the debt you came here to pay." Suddenly, a new player entered the game. A shot rang out, not from Silas, but from the general store. Patch Malone, seeing his chance in the chaos, was making his move. The bullet kicked up dust near Marla's feet. She spun, firing twice at the dark windows of the store, forcing Patch back into cover. But the distraction was all Silas Cord needed. He burst from behind the trough, firing as he ran, not at Marla, but towards the alley on the far side of the street. He was making a break for the darkness, for the desert, for one last, desperate chance at survival. Marla turned back from the store. She had a clear shot at the fleeing leader. She raised her pistol, but she didn't fire. She let him go. A strange, cold smile touched her lips. She wanted him. She wanted the leader. But she wanted him last. And she wanted him to know he was last. She holstered her pistol and turned her full attention to the general store. Patch Malone, the survivor, the pragmatist, was still in there. He was her next target. The head of the serpent could wait. First, she would methodically, inexorably, cut off the rest of its body. With Silas Cord vanished into the darkness and the saloon a roaring funeral pyre for his men, a tense quiet fell once more upon the street. It was now a duel between two seasoned professionals, Marla, the ghost who hunted for justice, and Patch Malone, the hardened outlaw who fought for his own survival. Patch was no fool. He was pinned in the general store, a building with large glass windows that offered little in the way of solid cover. He knew the woman outside was a surgeon with a gun. He also knew his only advantage was that she didn't know his exact location within the darkened store. Marla understood his thinking perfectly. Storming the store was a risk she didn't need to take. Instead, she would once again turn the town into her accomplice. She looked across at the undertaker's establishment, where she had been hiding. An idea, grim and fitting, began to form. She slipped into the undertaker's shop. The air was thick with the cloying smell of formaldehyde and sawdust. In the back workshop, she found what she was looking for, a collection of pine coffins in various sizes. She also found several coils of thin, black wire, used for floral arrangements. Working quickly and silently, she began her macabre project. She dragged two empty coffins out the back door and into the alley. Using the black wire, she rigged the batwing doors of the general store. She tied one end of a long wire to the inside handle of the left door, ran it across the street at ankle height, and threaded it through the undertaker's mail slot, anchoring it firmly to a heavy table inside. Any attempt to open that door from the inside would be met with firm resistance. She did something similar with the right door, but this wire she attached to the trigger of an old, rusted bear trap she had seen behind the blacksmith's forge. She dragged the heavy, vicious-looking trap and set it just outside the door, concealing it with a light scattering of dust and debris. If Patch tried to force that door, he'd get a nasty surprise. The front was now sealed. She moved to the back of the store. There was one heavy, barred door. It was their only other exit. This was where she would lay her final snare. She took one of the coffins and propped it upright against the outside of the back door, creating a grim, human-shaped barricade. Then, using a crowbar from Jebediah's forge, she pried loose the heavy wooden sign of the general store. It was a solid plank of oak, at least 10 feet long and weighing a few hundred pounds. With immense effort, she dragged it to the back alley and, using a system of ropes and the overhang of the roof, rigged it as a deadfall trap directly above the back door. The trigger mechanism was a wire connected to the coffin. If the coffin was pushed over from the inside, the sign would fall. The trap was set. Patch Malone was now sealed in his own wooden and glass tomb. Marla retreated to a new vantage point, the second-story window of the doctor's office, which gave her a clear view of both the front and back of the store. And then she began the psychological assault. She found a small stone and threw it against the front window of the general store. The sharp tink was loud in the silence. Patch, who was likely pressed against a wall inside, would have jumped at the sound. After a minute, she threw another, this time against a side window, then another against the back door. She was a ghost, knocking on every wall of his prison, reminding him that she was out there, everywhere, watching. Inside, Patch's nerves must have been screaming. The silence was his enemy. The sounds were his enemy. He was being toyed with. Marla waited for nearly an hour, letting the tension build to an unbearable level. Then, she started the final act. She went to the town's church at the end of the street. She didn't go inside. She climbed the bell tower. Using the bell's thick rope, she began to toll the bell. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was slow, deep, and mournful. The sound of a funeral. Each toll was a hammer blow against Patch's sanity. It was a countdown. A declaration. It was the sound of his own death approaching. The slow, methodical tolling was the final straw. Patch couldn't take the waiting, the silence, the knocking, and now the funereal bell. He had to get out. He had to do something. Marla, watching from the doctor's window, saw the back door of the general store begin to bulge outward. Patch was trying to force his way out the back. He put his shoulder to the door, pushing against the weight of the coffin. The coffin teetered, and then fell forward with a hollow clatter. The trigger wire pulled taut. The rope screeched. The heavy oak sign, a dark slab of judgment, fell from the roof. There was a sickening, final crunch. The bell stopped tolling. Silence returned to Dry Hollow. Marla climbed down from the bell tower. She walked to the back of the general store. Patch Malone, the last of the Dust Serpent enforcers, lay crushed beneath the sign that bore the name of the business he had helped terrorize. She looked at the scene, her face impassive. 7, 3, 1. The numbers had dwindled. Now, only the head of the serpent remained. Silas Cord was out there, somewhere in the desert, alone. And she knew he would not stay there. He was a creature of pride and ego. He would be back. For her. The final confrontation was yet to come. With Patch Malone's death, an unnerving quiet settled over Dry Hollow. It was not the quiet of peace, but the held breath before a final, violent exhale. The townsfolk, who had been locked in their homes, slowly began to emerge, their faces a mixture of terror, disbelief, and a dawning, fragile hope. They saw the burning ruin of the saloon, the bodies of the outlaws lying in the street, and the crushed form of Patch Malone in the back alley. They saw no avenger. Marla Kane had melted back into the shadows, her work not yet complete. She knew Silas Cord would return. He was not the type to slink away and die in the desert. His arrogance and his hatred were lifebloods, and they would draw him back to the source of his humiliation. He would come back for a final showdown. Marla did not wait in town. She did not want the townspeople caught in the crossfire. The final act of this play had to be performed on a stage of her own choosing. She chose the crossroads just south of town, a desolate spot where the main trail intersected an old, abandoned wagon road. It was a place of flat, open ground, surrounded by a few weathered rock formations, a natural amphitheater for a duel. She spent the day making her preparations. This would not be a sniper's kill or a trapper's snare. This was personal. This was for Thomas Miller. This would be face to face. She retrieved her match Schofields, cleaning and oiling them until they moved with the precision of a watchmaker's tools. She did not take her rifle. She walked to the crossroads and stood in the center, letting the hot desert wind whip at her dark clothes. She was making herself an obvious target, a clear and undeniable challenge. She did not have to wait long. As the sun began its slow descent, casting the landscape in blood-orange hues, a figure appeared on the trail from the south. It was Silas Cord. He was on foot, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and burned from the sun, but his eyes burned with a feverish, maniacal hatred. He held a pistol in his hand. He had come back. He stopped 100 feet from her, his chest heaving. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the barren ground, the wind whistling between them. "So, the ghost shows her face," Silas rasped, his voice cracked and dry. "I'm no ghost," Marla replied, her voice calm and level, a stark contrast to his ragged fury. "I'm just a widow you underestimated. I'll give you this, woman," he spat. "You've got style. But it ends here. Me and you." He gestured with his pistol. "No tricks. No traps. Just the gun. That's all I need," Marla said. The unspoken rules of the duel settled over them. It was high noon in the Soul. The sun was at their backs, casting their long shadows towards each other like outstretched hands. "When I heard a woman was hunting us, I laughed," Silas sneered, stalling, trying to get inside her head. "I never figured the quiet little farm mouse had so much venom." "You dug up my past when you shot that boy," Marla said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You should have let it lie buried." Silas's face contorted. The mention of the boy, the act that had started it all, seemed to break his final restraint. "To hell with you," he screamed, and he brought his gun up. He was fast, but he was fueled by rage, which made his movements jerky, imprecise. Marla was fueled by a cold, righteous certainty, and her movements were a fluid, economical poem of violence. Her hand blurred as she drew her right hand Schofield. She didn't aim so much as point. Her body, her arm, her gun an extension of her will. She fired a fraction of a second before he did. The two gunshots sounded almost as one. Silas's shout went wide, kicking up just a yard to her left. Marla's shot did not miss. It struck him square in the chest, right over the heart. The impact threw him back a step. A look of profound, almost comical surprise washed over his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, then back up at her. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dust, his pistol falling from his limp hand. The head of the dust serpent was dead. Marla stood there, her own pistol still smoking in her hand. The wind blew, kicking up a small dust devil that danced around Silas's body before spinning off into the desert. It was over. The last name was crossed off the ledger. The debt was paid in full. She walked over to the body. She looked down at the man who had brought so much death and fear. He looked smaller now, pathetic. She felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a vast, hollow silence where the storm of her vengeance had been. She turned and walked away, not back towards town, but towards the hidden canyon where she had left her horse. The past had been dug up, it had served its purpose, and now it was time to bury it again, perhaps for good this time. Marla rode away from Dry Hollow as the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky. She didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there but ghosts and graves. She had arrived as a widow seeking peace, and was leaving as a legend forged in violence. The town of Dry Hollow did not forget her. They buried their dead, including Sheriff Miller, with solemn respect. They took Silas Kurd's body and the bodies of his men and dumped them in an unmarked pit miles out in the desert. A final, ignominious end for the dust serpents. The townsfolk, led by Jebediah the blacksmith, began to rebuild. They were changed. The fragile hope they once had was gone, replaced by a harder, more resilient strength. They had looked into the abyss, and a quiet woman had pulled them back. They never spoke her name to outsiders. When curious travelers asked about the burned-out saloon or the bullet-pocked buildings, the residents would just shrug and say there was a bad bit of trouble with some outlaws a while back. But among themselves, the legend of the Kestrel was born. They would look at the Widow Kane's abandoned homestead, with its overgrown vegetable patch and the single, beautiful rosebush blooming over the storm cellar, and they would remember. They taught their children that true strength wasn't always loud and boastful, that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you notice the least. Marla Kane rode north. She rode for weeks, seeking not a destination, but a distance. She sold the Schofields and the Sharps rifle in a distant town to a collector who appreciated their craftsmanship without knowing their bloody history. The money was a burden, and she gave most of it away to a struggling family of homesteaders who reminded her of a life she once dreamed of. She kept only the knives, practical tools for a life in the wilderness, and the leather-bound ledger. Years later, in the high, misty mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a woman known only as Mara ran a small way station for weary travelers. She was quiet, her face weathered by sun and sorrow, her hands strong and capable. She rarely spoke of her past. But on quiet nights, by the light of a flickering fire, some said they would see her take out a small, leather-bound book. She would not read it, but simply trace the names on the pages with her finger. And then, one day, she took the book, walked to the fire, and dropped it into the flames. She watched as the pages curled, the names turning to black ash, the record of the kestrel's life, and the dust serpent's deaths turning to smoke and rising into the vast and knowable sky. The past was not an easy thing to bury. Sometimes, it had to be confronted, fought, and then, finally, released. As the last page burned, a traveler asked her what she was doing. She looked up from the fire, her eyes clear for the first time in a long time, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Just settling an old account," she said. The dust of Dry Hollow had finally settled, not just in the quiet streets of the town, but in the heart of the woman who had been its avenging angel. The kestrel was gone, her ledger closed. All that remained was Marlo, a woman at peace, finally, with the silence.